triggered by a firestorm bigger than one that killed the dinosaurs. It lasted 1,000 years. 12,800 years ago, Earth was struck by a disintegrating comet, setting off global firestorms. So I recently spoke with a geologist, Michael J. He taught at the Naval Academy out in California, and he has an idea that sea levels were particularly low before 13,000 years ago, and there was a massive impact, like a Pluto-like moon, if you will, that hit the Pacific Ocean and brought all kinds of water here, and he does all the scientific formulas to support his theory. And, I'm really thankful for his open-minded approach to it, because what he sees is this, like off the coast of California, in the Monterey Canyon region, here's an explanation of it. In a relatively recent BBC article, geologist Daniel Parsons is quoted as saying about Monterey Canyon, off the coast of California, if you drained all the water away, it will look exactly like a river system with bends and meanders, except there are no trees along the bank. So this geologist is looking at the evidence, just like Michael J. is, and as well as in the Atlantic, off the coast of California, they're saying that these land masses were probably above water 15,000 years ago, which is vastly different from current geological theory. So Casey has a reading when he's asked about the details regarding the physiognomy, habits, and customs of the people of Atlantis before the first construction. And he says this rather odd thing to say that is verified or corroborated by many other historical sources. So he says that these beings who lived on Atlantis took on many sizes of stature, from the midget to the giants, for there were giants in the earth in those days, men as tall as what would be termed today 10 or 12 feet in stature and well proportioned throughout. Now my friends Greg and Laura Little and John Van Auken are students of Casey as well, and they wrote a book about Casey's Forgotten Record of Ancient America. Now once again, Casey dives into all these subjects, and what you find is there's a lot of strange corroborative proof for these things that he says that are considered off the wall. Now, he talked about the peopling of America happening much earlier than once thought. And at the time in the 30s, and when he spoke about these things, he was completely dismissed. He's like, nobody's been in the U.S. before 10,000 BC. These are ludicrous ideas. But science is continuing to verify what Casey had to say. So in one of his readings, he says, those in Yucatan, those in the adjoining lands as begun by Iltar, gradually lost their activities and came to be that people termed in other portions of America as the mound builders. So the mound builders are this group of native tribes that built structures all around the eastern United States. In Alabama and Florida, the entity's sojourns then were with those of a race of unusual height, unusual proportions to what may be termed in the present, for they were the lords of the land. Now he talks about beings reincarnating, and this really kind of disturbed him because he was a very conservative Christian. But in this trance-like state, he would talk about things like past lives and the universal library. So this account seems to be verified by lots of accounts that we've uncovered about, unusually large native people who lived in the regions of Alabama and Georgia and Florida. Here's an account here. Must have been 9 feet tall. And here's Tuscaloosa, the giant native chief. Him and his father were both reported by chroniclers to be well over 7 foot tall. So the second generation of Atlanteans who struggled northward from Yucatan settled in what is now a portion of Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, being among those of the early period known as the mound builders. So, there's a lot of weird racist stuff about, the origins of natives, or white giants, came and built all these mounds and things like that. What I would say to that is that I believe that native populations are a melting pot of different races and refugees from lost continents. I don't want to try to take away anything from indigenous people around the planet. This idea of great civilizers showing up, it was twisted around by the Spanish, in their Christian orientation, like we're bringing civilization to these people. Where frankly, what came out of Europe was nothing but destruction all around the planet, frankly, the decimation of all these indigenous people. I would say after the flood, in the story that there were civilizers that showed up everywhere to civilize all of humanity. It's not a racial thing at all. And, you know, that is not my orientation at all. I'm like a Bernie Sanders, lock up the bankers, left-wing guy, you know, just to throw it out there. So the mound builders, you know, lived from about 1000 BC, the Adena people, through the Hopewell to the Mississippians, who existed about into 1500 AD. And they built sites like Cahokia and Grave Creek and these geometric forms. And here's another reading that's really interesting. When there had been the activities in and among the chiefs of the 5 great nations as they met in their powwow within the Octagon, which is in Ohio, what is now known as the Bank of the Ohio, the entity then acted as the counsel to those people as to how they might better themselves, even with the relationships to those peoples that later entered in to become the settlers of the land. So these native chiefs, these mystics and clairvoyants, understood that these white settlers were going to come into their land. And Casey says they met at the Great Circle and Octagon to devise, you know, how do we deal with this onslaught that's going to occur. So I just found that was particularly an interesting and specific account that Casey laid out. He gave 68 readings about the mound builders, which is a really obscure subject for anybody. Even now, as students of archaeology and anthropology, we hear very little of the activities of ancient American native people who did all these astonishing works of geometry and mathematics. But Casey, with an eighth grade education in a trance-like state, talked specifically about these mounds and what they meant. And the mounds that were called the replica or representative of the Yucatan experiences, as well as the Atlantean and the Gobi land, all of these are as one consciousness in the entity's activity. Now, what Casey is saying that that the Atlanteans went to, one of the places they went to was the Yucatan after the flood 10,600 years ago. And that these representations you find in the mounds of ancient America were basically a ceremonial representation of the flooded land of Atlantis. Like in Circleville, Ohio, you have this ancient site that a town was built around. In Portsmouth, Ohio, you have this representation of the central city of Atlantis, which right here is Plato's representation of what it looked like. So that is what Casey specifically said. There's moats and ditches and around these circular enclosures, and archaeologists don't know what to make of them. They were flooded with water at one point, and they acted as a ceremonial representation of the lost continent of Atlantis in its central city. So in 10,600 BC, after the flood, then with the leavings of their civilization in Atlantis, in Poseidia more specific, Iltar with a group of followers that had been of the household of Atlan, the followers of the worship of the One, with some 10 individuals, left this land, Poseidia, and came westward, entering what would now be a portion of Yucatan. So he's saying Iltar was an Atlantean temple priest who went to the Yucatan to bury the lost Hall of Records, one of them. Another is under the Sphinx in Egypt that Casey talks about. And there began with the activities of the people there, the development into a civilization that rose much in the same manner as that which had been in the Atlantean land. Those in the Yucatan, those in the adjoining lands as begun by Iltar, gradually lost in their activities and came to be what was termed the American mound builders. So what happened was the temples of sacrifice turned to temples of human sacrifice, that the negative influences that occurred in Atlantis and caused the destruction popped up again in the Mesoamerican lands. And who the group that was to become the American mound builders actually ventured northward, and they were a benevolent race that created the earthworks of the Ohio River Valley. So in the Yucatan, this place where Atlantean refugees were supposed to land, Casey said it was a melting pot of different cultures that showed up there. And if you look at the mystery of the Olmecs, you'll see that there are many Asian and African looking people that you find on the artifacts there. Here's me and my buddy Hugh with the stone heads. Many of them looked West African or Samoan. You find Asian influences. You find skull elongation. So Casey basically says that it was a melting pot in the Yucatan, and it seems to be borne out by the sophistication of the Olmecs and the physical characteristics that you see on their statues. He also says that the lost tribes of Israel went and joined the mound builders around in 3000 BC. And then when asked how did they reach this country, he just says in boats. Now here's an ancient earthwork in East Fork, Ohio, that was now destroyed. The interesting thing about this is it's called the Hanukkah Mound, and Thomas Jefferson had the Army Corps of Engineers survey it, I believe in 1823, if not a little earlier. And it wasn't a military, earthwork at all. It had nothing to do with basically what the Army Corps of Engineers would do. But the thought is that Jefferson was kind of enamored with this idea that was their lost races that blended with native peoples. So it is now destroyed, but it's in the U.S. records that can be found, this ancient earthwork that supposedly looked like a Hanukkah mound. By what power or powers were these early pyramids and temples constructed? By the lifting forces of those gases that are being used gradually in the present civilization, and by the fine work or activity of those versed in that pertaining to the sources from which all power comes. Basically, Casey was asked about how a lot of the astonishing megalithic sites around the planet were built, and he talked about a lost science that is attributed to these masters, these temple priests who had an ability to control the forces of nature, and they used like light and sound and levitation to create. It wasn't like a CNC machine like you think Puma Punku might have been built by. So for as long as there remains those pure in body, mind, and activity to the law of the one God, there is continued resource for meeting the needs or for commanding the elements and their activities in the supply of the necessary in such relations. I know he speaks in a really arcane way, and I'll point out when he's talking about one God, he's not talking about a white God in the sky who's pissed off half the time. He's talking about an abstract universal field of awareness that we are a part of. So Casey says that light, sound, vibration technology, and levitation were used to build the early Yucatan temples, now gone. The Peruvian and Bolivian structures, which he attributes to Atlantean colonies as far back as 28,000 years ago, and the Great Pyramid of Egypt, built between 10,490 BC and 10,390 BC. He claims the pyramid was not 2,750 BC in its construction, but a much earlier date built by Atlantean refugees, and that the astonishing stonework you see in Peru and Bolivia, it was in fact an Atlantean colony. So this is a reading talking about Peru. And Ahum, that builded the walls across the mountains in this period, through those same usages of that as has been taken on by those peoples, and also into the American area, and became the first of the mound dwellers or peoples in this land. He's talking about these Atlantean refugees. And from a stonemason and engineering perspective, I can tell you that a lot of the structures I see, like Sacsayhuaman and parts of Machu Picchu, are well beyond the ability to create them by the tools of the time. Normally these structures are attributed to the Inca in the 1500s or things like that. I say it was literally impossible to do things like some of the stonework from a mason's and engineering perspective. And I just got to stick with that. Maybe a master mason will prove me wrong someday, but it's not, for me, it's not a matter of time. I could not construct any of these constructions I'll show you using the tools of the time. It's just utterly impossible. Here I am with Brian Forrester talking about this pillowing of stones in Cusco, the incredibly tight joints, the fact it almost looks like the stone was melted, that there was some weird technology that we don't understand at work. In the 50s, this wall was uncovered by an earthquake, I believe. So you see the old, some would say Atlantean work, and then you see the Inca work in front of it. And this is what the wall looks like today. So a prime example that the Inca, after the fact, built a second layer of construction in a different age. So his patchwork, this is Inca, that's Spanish, this is megalithic, pre-Diluvian. And his Ollantaytambo, incredible stonework, incredible joinery, And when you're shaping something like this, you know, you work so long to get it right, and then you fit it together. And what if it's off just a little? What do you throw the stone away? You know, when you look through all the joints, you can't get a micron between these. Forget about a razor blade. It's so outrageous and astonishing. And these little details in there, you'd never do that unless you just could do it easily. It is so beyond comprehension for me. I'm just awestruck when I look at the stonework over and over again. And frankly, you know, your standard architect